Listen carefully. Most people move through life believing power belongs to the loudest voice, the strongest body, or the most popular man in the room. But they are wrong. Power rarely belongs to the obvious. Real power belongs to the man who understands human nature, the silent fears, the hidden insecurities, the fragile ego that every person hides behind a carefully crafted mask. The moment you begin to see this, something changes inside you. Conversations begin to feel different. People become predictable. Their words reveal their weaknesses. Their reactions expose their fears. And suddenly you realize a dangerous truth. The world is not controlled by the most moral men. It is controlled by the men who understand psychology better than everyone else in the room. Centuries ago, Machiavelli understood this better than most men ever will. He did not teach kindness or fairness. He taught control. Because once you understand human behavior, you understand the hidden machinery that moves society itself. People crave approval. They fear exclusion. And above all, they obey confidence. These three instincts silently govern most human decisions. And if you learn to see them, you will begin to notice how often they are used against you. In business meetings, in relationships, in politics, and even in everyday conversations. The difference between the controlled and the controller is not strength. It is awareness. That is why today, you are about to learn 5 dark psychological tactics that instantly shift the balance of power in your favor. Not cheap manipulation, not childish mind games. These are psychological weapons used by leaders, negotiators, and men who refuse to be dominated. Once you understand them, you stop reacting to the world. Instead, the world begins reacting to you. But before we go further, I want you to make a decision. If you are serious about mastering psychological control, write this in the comments right now. I move in silence. I control the game. Because the moment you truly understand what comes next, something changes in the way you see people forever. This is Psygrythm, where we study power, psychology, and the silent strategies of men who refuse to be controlled. And the first tactic begins with something most people underestimate completely. Silence. The first trick, the power of strategic silence. The first dark psychology tactic that instantly shifts power in your favor is something most men underestimate completely. It is not aggression. It is not dominance. It is not even intelligence. It is silence. Strategic silence is one of the most uncomfortable psychological pressures you can place on another human being. Most people are terrified of it. The human mind hates empty space in conversation. It feels like tension. It feels like uncertainty. And the average person will do almost anything to escape that discomfort. They will explain too much. They will reveal information they never intended to share. They will start negotiating against themselves. All because you refused to rush in and fill the silence. Watch carefully the next time you are in a conversation, negotiation, or confrontation. The weaker person always speaks first. The weaker person always rushes to explain. They defend themselves before they are even accused. They justify their position before anyone questions it. And in doing so, they slowly hand over control of the interaction. But the man who understands silence understands something deeper about human psychology. Silence forces the other person to confront their own thoughts. And most people are deeply uncomfortable with their own thoughts. That discomfort becomes pressure. And pressure creates mistakes. This is why powerful leaders, negotiators, and high-level strategists rarely rush to speak. They observe. They listen. They allow the other person to reveal themselves. While most people talk to be understood, the man who understands power listens to gather leverage. Every sentence someone speaks voluntarily is information. Information about their priorities, their insecurities, their intentions, their emotional triggers. And once you know those things, the game changes completely. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago, even if he never described it using modern psychological terms. He believed that a wise ruler must observe more than he reveals. Because the moment people understand your full intentions, they begin preparing defenses against you. But when you remain quiet, calm, and difficult to read, something interesting happens. People begin projecting their own assumptions onto you. They fill in the blanks themselves. And those assumptions often work in your favor. Imagine two men in a negotiation. One speaks constantly, trying to convince, explain, persuade. The other listens carefully, asking very few questions, responding with patience, and allowing silence to linger after every statement. Who appears more confident? Who appears more powerful? The answer is obvious. Confidence does not rush. Confidence does not chase approval. Confidence sits comfortably in silence because it knows it already holds value. Silence also has another psychological effect that most people never notice. It creates mystery, and mystery commands attention. When someone speaks constantly, they reveal everything about themselves very quickly. Their thoughts become predictable. Their reactions become obvious. But when someone speaks selectively, carefully choosing when to respond and when to remain silent, they become difficult to read. And the human mind is naturally fascinated by what it cannot easily understand. This is why powerful individuals often appear calm and measured in conversation. They are not reacting emotionally. They are studying the room. Every facial expression, every shift in tone, every hesitation in someone's voice. While others are busy talking, they are busy collecting information. And information is the true currency of control. But strategic silence does not mean you never speak. That would be weakness. Silence is powerful only when it is used deliberately. When you do speak, your words must carry weight. Short sentences, clear statements, no unnecessary explanations. The fewer words you use, the more people listen when you finally decide to say something. It creates psychological gravity. People lean in, they pay attention, because they know your words are not wasted. There is also a deeper reason silence works so effectively. Most people live in a constant state of mental noise. Social media, notifications, endless conversations, opinions everywhere. Their minds are overwhelmed. When someone suddenly introduces calm, steady silence into that environment, it feels unusual, powerful even. It signals emotional control. And emotional control is one of the clearest signals of authority the human brain recognizes. Think about the last time you saw someone lose control in a conversation. Maybe they became angry. Maybe they started raising their voice. Maybe they began speaking faster and louder, trying to dominate the interaction. In that moment, they probably believed they were showing strength. But psychologically, the opposite happened. They revealed emotional instability. And emotional instability is a weakness that skilled observers notice immediately. The man who practices strategic silence does the opposite. He does not react impulsively. He pauses before responding. He allows the other person to reveal their emotional state first. And that pause, that moment of quiet observation, often changes the entire dynamic of the interaction. Suddenly, the other person becomes aware of their own behavior. Suddenly, they begin second-guessing themselves. And while they are questioning their position, you remain calm and grounded. This is not manipulation. This is psychological discipline. It is the ability to control your own impulses while others struggle to control theirs. And in the world of power dynamics, the person who controls themselves usually ends up controlling the situation. So the next time you enter a conversation, remember this. You do not need to dominate the room with noise. You do not need to prove your intelligence by speaking constantly. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is simply waiting, listening, observing, letting the other person reveal more than they intended. Because once people start talking, they rarely realize how much they expose. If this mindset resonates with you, write this in the comments right now. Silence is my advantage. Let that phrase remind you that real power is rarely loud. Real power is calm, observant, and impossible to rush. And now that you understand the first tactic, we move to the second dark psychological trick, one that quietly reshapes how people perceive you before you even say a word. The second dark psychology tactic that instantly places you in control is something most people never realize is happening to them. It happens before the first argument, before the first negotiation, before the first real conversation even begins. It is called controlling the frame. And once you understand it, you will start noticing it everywhere. In business meetings, in debates, in relationships, even in casual conversations between friends. The person who controls the frame controls how the entire interaction will be interpreted. Most people walk into conversations already playing by someone else's rules. They react to the tone that has been set. They respond to accusations that were never proven. They defend positions that were never truly questioned. Without realizing it, they step into a psychological arena designed by someone else. And the moment they do, they are already fighting from a disadvantaged position. But the man who understands power knows something critical. The strongest move in any psychological interaction is not reacting to the frame. It is creating the frame yourself. A frame is simply the lens through which people interpret a situation. It determines what is considered strong or weak, reasonable or unreasonable, confident or insecure. Whoever defines that lens quietly shapes the outcome before the real discussion even begins. Imagine two people entering a negotiation. One begins by saying, "Let's see if we can come to a fair compromise." The other begins by saying, "I only work with serious people who understand the value of what I offer." Both sentences lead into the same conversation, but psychologically they create very different frames. In the first frame, both people are expected to compromise. In the second frame, the speaker has already positioned themselves as the one holding value, while the other must prove they are worthy of the opportunity. This is not magic. It is perception, and perception is the invisible battlefield where power is actually decided. Machiavelli understood this dynamic long before modern psychology gave it a name. He observed that rulers who allowed others to define their reputation quickly lost authority, but those who shaped their own image, their own narrative, influenced how people interpreted everything they did. The frame becomes the story people believe about you. And once people believe a story, they begin unconsciously searching for evidence that confirms it. Think about how often this happens in everyday life. A person enters a room acting uncertain, apologizing frequently, explaining themselves before anyone even questions them. Instantly, the room interprets them as lower status. Now imagine another person entering calmly, speaking slowly, and behaving as though their presence already carries weight. The room reacts differently. People listen more carefully. They assume competence before it is even demonstrated. Nothing about reality changed, only the frame changed. That is the power of psychological framing. When you control the frame, you subtly influence how people interpret your actions, your words, and even your silence. A confident frame turns quietness into authority. A weak frame turns quietness into insecurity. The behavior is the same. The interpretation is different. And interpretation is what shapes people's reactions. There are several ways powerful individuals establish their frame. The first is through certainty. Most people speak with hesitation. They soften their statements with phrases like "I think," "maybe," or "I'm not sure but." These phrases signal doubt before the idea is even evaluated. But the man who understands psychological influence speaks with calm certainty. Not arrogance, not aggression, simply clarity. Statements like "this is how I see the situation," or "here is what works." Certainty invites others to step into your perspective instead of questioning whether you even believe it yourself. The second method of controlling the frame is refusing unnecessary defense. When someone challenges you unfairly, the instinct of most people is to immediately defend themselves. They rush to prove their innocence, justify their intentions, or explain their decisions. But psychologically, defending yourself too quickly often reinforces the accusation. It signals that the challenge has already destabilized you. Powerful individuals understand a different approach. They slow down the conversation. They ask questions. They redirect attention back toward the person making the accusation. Suddenly, the frame shifts from "you must defend yourself" to "why are they making this claim in the first place?" This shift is subtle but incredibly powerful. Another way to control the frame is through selective attention. Not every statement deserves a response. Not every challenge deserves acknowledgement. Skilled communicators understand that attention itself is a form of power. When you react to every comment, you allow others to guide the conversation wherever they choose. But when you respond only to what truly matters, you silently establish that your attention must be earned. Think about the calm authority of someone who hears criticism but chooses not to engage emotionally with it. Instead of reacting defensively, they address only the part of the conversation that moves the discussion forward. The emotional bait is ignored, and when emotional bait is ignored, it loses its power. Another powerful framing tactic involves defining the purpose of the interaction early. If you walk into a conversation without clear intention, others will unconsciously set the direction for you. But if you calmly state the purpose at the beginning, "Here's what we're here to figure out," or "let's focus on the real issue," you shape the boundaries of the discussion. Suddenly the conversation moves along a path you defined. People often underestimate how strongly human psychology follows structure. Once a structure is established, most people naturally continue operating within it. But controlling the frame also requires emotional discipline, because once you set the frame, others may try to challenge it. They may raise their voice. They may introduce distractions. They may attempt to provoke emotional reactions. This is where many people lose control. They abandon their frame and begin reacting impulsively. But the individual who understands psychological power remains steady. They calmly bring the conversation back to the original frame again and again. Eventually, the other person either adapts or reveals their own instability, and instability always weakens the person displaying it. Over time, people begin to recognize the difference between someone who reacts to situations and someone who defines them. One follows the conversation, the other leads it. This is why the most influential figures rarely allow themselves to be pulled into chaotic arguments. They define the context first. They establish the lens through which the discussion will unfold. And once that lens is accepted, every statement made afterward is interpreted through it. If silence was the first weapon of psychological control, framing is the second. Silence gathers information. Framing shapes perception. Together they form a powerful foundation for influence. And once you begin using them consciously, something interesting happens. People start responding to you differently. They pause before challenging you. They listen more closely to your words. They sense an invisible structure guiding the conversation, even if they cannot explain why. Because leadership is not always about speaking the loudest. Sometimes it is about quietly deciding how the entire conversation will be understood. If you're beginning to recognize this shift in mindset, write this in the comments right now. I define the frame. Let that phrase remind you that power is often established long before the real conversation even begins. But there is another psychological tactic even more unsettling than silence or framing. A tactic that quietly destabilizes people without open confrontation. The third dark psychology tactic that places you firmly in control is something that most people instinctively avoid, yet the most powerful individuals master it with precision. It is controlled unpredictability. Human beings crave patterns. Our brains are wired to search for predictability in the behavior of others, because predictability makes people easier to manage. When someone behaves the same way every time, we learn how to influence them. We learn what triggers them, what pleases them, and what pressures will make them give in. In other words, predictability makes a person controllable. But the moment your behavior becomes difficult to predict, something interesting happens psychologically. People stop trying to control you and start trying to understand you. When someone cannot easily anticipate your reactions, your words begin to carry more weight. Every decision you make suddenly matters more. Every response becomes something others analyze more carefully. This is because unpredictability introduces a subtle tension into the social environment. The human mind begins asking questions. What will he do next? How will he respond? Where does he stand? And when people begin asking those questions, they are already giving you psychological space. Think about how often people fall into predictable behavioral patterns. The man who always tries to please others. The man who always reacts with anger. The man who always explains himself when challenged. These patterns quickly become visible to anyone paying attention. Once a pattern is recognized, it becomes easy to exploit. If someone knows you will always respond emotionally to criticism, they can provoke you whenever they want. If someone knows you will always seek approval, they can manipulate your need for validation. Predictable behavior is comfortable, but comfort often creates vulnerability. Machiavelli observed this centuries ago in the world of political power. Leaders who behaved in completely predictable ways became easy targets for their rivals. Their enemies could anticipate their decisions, prepare counter-strategies, and slowly weaken their authority. But rulers who occasionally acted in ways that surprised both allies and enemies created a psychological advantage. Their intentions became harder to calculate, their strategies harder to predict, and that uncertainty made others cautious. Now understand something important. Controlled unpredictability does not mean chaos. It does not mean acting impulsively or emotionally. That would be weakness, not strategy. Real unpredictability is deliberate. It is measured. It is controlled. You remain calm, consistent in your values, but flexible in your responses. People cannot easily categorize you. And because they cannot categorize you, they cannot easily manipulate you. Consider a simple example. Most people expect immediate reactions during conflict. If someone challenges you, they expect you to defend yourself immediately or respond emotionally. But imagine responding differently. Imagine pausing, observing, and replying later when emotions have cooled. That alone disrupts the expected pattern. The other person suddenly loses their psychological footing because the reaction they expected never arrived. Another example appears in leadership. Many leaders try to appear agreeable all the time because they want to be liked. But the desire to be liked creates predictability. People begin assuming they can pressure that leader into compromises. However, a leader who sometimes surprises others with firm decisions sends a different message. It communicates that approval is not the driving force behind their actions. And once people realize approval cannot easily influence you, their strategy changes. Controlled unpredictability also creates psychological respect. Humans instinctively respect individuals they cannot easily dominate or manipulate. When your reactions cannot be predicted, People become more careful around you. They think before speaking. They consider their words more deliberately. In a strange way, unpredictability introduces a layer of psychological distance that prevents others from becoming too comfortable controlling your behavior. But the most powerful form of unpredictability lies in emotional control. Imagine someone trying to provoke you into anger, expecting the same reaction they have seen before. Instead, you respond with calm observation. The emotional trap they set suddenly collapses because it no longer triggers the expected outcome. In that moment, the psychological advantage shifts completely. They are the one reacting. You are the one observing. This is why emotionally disciplined individuals often appear intimidating without trying to be. Their calmness cannot be easily shaken. Their reactions are measured rather than automatic. And because others cannot predict when or how they will respond, their presence carries quiet authority. There is also another psychological layer to this tactic that few people recognize. When someone behaves in ways that occasionally surprise us, our brains pay closer attention to them. Novelty captures attention. Predictability fades into the background. This is why people who behave in identical ways every day slowly become invisible in social dynamics. But those who occasionally disrupt expectations remain memorable. However, unpredictability must always remain controlled. If your behavior becomes completely random, people will interpret it as instability. Instability destroys trust. The goal is not confusion. The goal is strategic uncertainty. Others should know your values, your standards, and your boundaries, but they should never feel fully confident predicting exactly how you will respond in every situation. This balance between consistency and unpredictability is where psychological strength emerges. Your principles remain firm. Your reactions remain flexible. Think about the calm strategist who listens quietly most of the time, but occasionally speaks with decisive clarity. Or the person who normally maintains composure, but suddenly shows firm boundaries when necessary. These moments create psychological impact precisely because they break the expected pattern. People begin realizing something important. You are not operating on autopilot. You are choosing your responses deliberately. And deliberate behavior is far more difficult to control than automatic behavior. This tactic also protects you from another common psychological trap: emotional conditioning. Many people become conditioned to react in predictable ways to certain triggers. A certain tone of voice causes frustration. A certain criticism causes defensiveness. A certain compliment causes immediate compliance. When others recognize these triggers, they begin using them intentionally. But the individual who practices controlled unpredictability refuses to operate on predictable emotional triggers. They pause, they observe their own reactions, and sometimes they choose a response completely different from what others expect. This ability to disrupt expectations quietly shifts power in subtle ways. Because when people realize they cannot easily trigger your reactions, they lose one of their most effective tools of control. And that realization changes how they interact with you. If silence gathered information and framing shaped perception, then controlled unpredictability introduces psychological uncertainty. The kind that makes others watch you more carefully. The kind that makes them think twice before trying to manipulate the situation. Because when someone cannot predict you, they cannot easily control you. If this mindset resonates with you, write this phrase in the comments right now: "My mind cannot be predicted." Let that phrase remind you that real psychological strength is not about constant aggression or dominance. Sometimes it is simply about refusing to become predictable. But the next tactic goes even deeper into the psychology of power. Because the fourth dark strategy is not about silence, framing, or unpredictability. It is about something far more dangerous: Strategic detachment. The ability to remain emotionally untouchable while others are ruled by their feelings. And once you understand it, you will see why the most powerful individuals often appear calm even in the middle of chaos. The fourth dark psychology tactic that instantly places you in a position of control is something that many people misunderstand completely. It is strategic detachment. Not indifference. Not coldness for the sake of cruelty. Strategic detachment is the ability to remain emotionally unshaken while others are ruled by their feelings. It is the quiet discipline of separating your decisions from the emotional storms that dominate most human behavior. And in a world where people constantly react instead of thinking, the man who masters detachment becomes extremely difficult to influence. Human beings are emotional creatures. We like to believe we are logical, rational, and balanced, but in reality, most decisions are shaped by emotions first and justified by logic afterward. Fear, anger, pride, jealousy, admiration, insecurity, these invisible forces silently guide conversations, arguments, negotiations, and relationships. The person who reacts emotionally is often unaware that their emotions are revealing valuable information. They show what triggers them. They show what matters most to them. They show where they can be pressured. And the moment someone understands your emotional triggers, they hold leverage over you. Machiavelli understood this long before psychologists gave it a name. He warned that rulers who allowed their emotions to guide their decisions became vulnerable to manipulation. Anger could push them into reckless actions. Fear could push them into defensive weakness. Pride could blind them to strategic reality. But the ruler who observed emotions without being controlled by them held an enormous advantage, because while others were reacting, he was thinking. Strategic detachment works because it interrupts the emotional patterns people expect. Most social dynamics depend on emotional reactions. Someone insults you expecting anger. Someone praises you expecting gratitude. Someone pressures you expecting anxiety. These emotional responses are predictable, and predictability creates influence. But when you remove the expected emotional reaction, the psychological balance of the interaction changes immediately. Imagine someone criticizing you publicly, expecting you to become defensive. Instead of reacting emotionally, you remain calm and respond slowly, with clarity. The emotional trap collapses because the reaction it depended on never arrived. Suddenly, the person who attempted the attack appears unstable while you appear composed. The audience observes the contrast. And in that contrast, authority shifts. This is why emotionally disciplined individuals often command silent respect. It is not because they are loud or aggressive. It is because their emotional state cannot easily be controlled by others. Strategic detachment also prevents something far more dangerous: emotional manipulation. Many people do not consciously manipulate others, but they instinctively learn how to influence emotional responses. They raise their voice to create pressure. They express disappointment to trigger guilt. They exaggerate urgency to provoke anxiety. These tactics work because most people react emotionally before analyzing the situation. But when you practice detachment, you introduce a pause between stimulus and response. Someone raises their voice. Instead of reacting instantly, you observe. Why are they raising their voice? What reaction are they hoping to provoke? What outcome are they trying to force? In that pause, clarity appears, and clarity weakens manipulation. This ability to pause before reacting is one of the clearest signals of psychological strength. Most people react automatically. Something happens, and their emotions respond instantly. But the man who practices detachment interrupts this automatic pattern. He allows emotions to exist without immediately acting on them. He observes them like passing weather, rather than permanent commands. Anger appears. He notices it. Frustration appears. He notices it. But he does not allow those emotions to control his decisions. This discipline creates something powerful: emotional independence. When your emotional state is not easily influenced by others, your behavior becomes much harder to manipulate. People cannot pressure you through guilt. They cannot provoke you into impulsive reactions. They cannot rush your decisions through emotional urgency. And once people realize their emotional strategies do not work on you, they begin approaching you differently. But strategic detachment has another effect that is rarely discussed. It changes how you interpret situations. When emotions dominate your thinking, every interaction feels personal. Criticism feels like an attack. Disagreement feels like disrespect. Rejection feels like humiliation. These emotional interpretations distort reality and push people into unnecessary conflicts. Detachment removes this distortion. Instead of asking, "Why are they attacking me?" you begin asking, "What are they trying to achieve?" Instead of reacting to tone, you analyze intention. Instead of defending your ego, you focus on outcomes. This shift from emotional interpretation to strategic observation changes the way you move through the world. Situations that once felt overwhelming suddenly become manageable. Conflicts that once felt personal become tactical. You stop fighting emotional battles and start evaluating strategic opportunities. This does not mean becoming emotionless. That would be unnatural and unhealthy. Strategic detachment simply means your emotions do not control your decisions. You feel them, but you are not governed by them. Think about the calm strategist standing in the middle of chaos. Others are panicking, raising their voices, reacting impulsively. But the strategist remains steady, scanning the situation, identifying patterns, calculating possibilities. That calm presence immediately attracts attention. People begin looking toward the person who appears most stable. Because stability signals leadership. Human psychology instinctively trusts the individual who remains composed when others lose control. And once that trust appears, influence follows. Strategic detachment also protects you from a common trap: the need for validation. Many people allow their emotional state to depend on the approval of others. Praise lifts their confidence. Criticism destroys it. But when your emotional stability depends on outside validation, others gain enormous power over you. The man who practices detachment breaks this dependency. He does not rely on applause to feel confident. He does not collapse when someone disapproves. His sense of direction comes from internal clarity rather than external approval. And that independence creates psychological gravity. People are naturally drawn toward individuals who are not desperate for acceptance. Because someone who does not chase approval appears to possess something valuable: self-respect. Strategic detachment also strengthens patience. Emotional reactions often push people into rushed decisions. Anger demands immediate retaliation. Fear demands immediate escape. Anxiety demands immediate reassurance. But when you detach from these emotional impulses, you gain something extremely powerful: time. Time to think. Time to observe. Time to choose the most effective response rather than the fastest one. And in complex situations, the person who thinks before acting almost always holds the advantage. If silence gathers information, and framing shapes perception, and unpredictability disrupts expectations, then detachment protects your psychological independence. It prevents others from steering your behavior through emotional pressure. And once people realize they cannot easily influence your emotional state, they begin respecting your presence differently. Because emotional control is rare. Most people are ruled by their impulses. Most people react before they think. But the man who observes calmly while others react impulsively begins to stand apart. He becomes difficult to provoke, difficult to pressure, difficult to manipulate. And in the silent language of power dynamics, difficulty to manipulate equals strength. If you understand the importance of this discipline, write this phrase in the comments right now. My emotions do not control me. Let that phrase remind you that the strongest mind is not the one that never feels emotion. It is the one that chooses how to respond to it. But there is one final psychological tactic that ties everything together. A tactic that determines whether others follow your direction or attempt to challenge it. The fifth and final dark psychology strategy. Controlled dominance. The ability to project quiet authority without unnecessary aggression. And in the next section, you will discover why the most powerful individuals rarely need to prove their power at all. The fifth and final dark psychology tactic that instantly places you in control is something many people misunderstand completely. When they hear the word dominance, they imagine aggression, loud voices, intimidation, or force. But real psychological dominance rarely looks like that. True dominance is controlled, it is calm, it is quiet, and it is rooted in the subtle signals that communicate authority without needing to demand it. The most powerful individuals do not constantly prove their strength. They project it in a way that others instinctively recognize. Human beings are incredibly sensitive to status signals. Long before language became complex, our ancestors learned to read body language, tone of voice, posture, and emotional stability to determine who held influence in a group. These signals still guide our perceptions today. The way someone stands, the pace at which they speak, the way they respond under pressure, these cues silently shape how others interpret their authority. And most people are completely unaware of how much these signals influence their behavior. Controlled dominance begins with something simple: presence. When you enter a room, people immediately form impressions about you, not based on what you say, but based on how you carry yourself. Are you rushed, apologetic, uncertain, or are you calm, grounded, and comfortable in your own space? The difference between those two states is enormous. Someone who appears rushed and uncertain invites others to take control of the interaction. Someone who appears calm and composed signals that they already feel secure in their position. Machiavelli understood the importance of this perception centuries ago. He believed that authority depended not only on real power, but also on the appearance of strength. A ruler who appeared hesitant or weak invited challenges, but a ruler who projected stability and confidence often avoided challenges entirely. Because people rarely test individuals who seem certain of their authority. This is where controlled dominance separates itself from aggression. Aggression often reveals insecurity. When someone raises their voice, interrupts others constantly, or tries to overpower every conversation, they may believe they are demonstrating strength. But psychologically, these behaviors often signal the opposite. They reveal emotional instability and a need to prove superiority, and people eventually notice that pattern. Controlled dominance does not need to prove itself. It communicates strength through restraint. The calm leader who listens before speaking. The negotiator who speaks slowly and clearly instead of rushing. The individual who maintains eye contact without staring aggressively. These behaviors create an atmosphere of quiet authority. People sense it even when they cannot explain it. Another essential component of controlled dominance is boundaries. Many people try to maintain peace by allowing others to cross their boundaries repeatedly. They tolerate disrespect. They accept unfair treatment. They allow their time and energy to be taken without question. At first, this behavior may seem cooperative, but psychologically, it signals something very different. It communicates that their limits are flexible, negotiable, and easily ignored. Powerful individuals understand that boundaries are not aggressive, they are clarifying. They communicate where respect begins and where it ends. And when boundaries are enforced calmly and consistently, they reshape how people interact with you. Imagine someone speaking to you disrespectfully. Most people will either react emotionally or avoid confrontation entirely. But controlled dominance introduces a third option. You respond calmly and directly. You clarify the behavior without escalating the situation. The message is simple: respect is expected, and disrespect will not be entertained. This approach changes the dynamic immediately, because while emotional reactions create chaos, calm boundaries create structure, and people instinctively adjust to structure. Controlled dominance also involves something that many people struggle with: decisiveness. Indecision creates uncertainty, and uncertainty weakens authority. When someone constantly hesitates, delays decisions, or seeks endless reassurance, others begin losing confidence in their leadership. But the person who evaluates information calmly and then chooses a direction communicates something powerful: responsibility. Responsibility attracts influence. People trust those who are willing to make decisions. Even if the decision is not perfect, decisiveness signals that someone is capable of guiding action rather than avoiding it. However, decisive behavior must always remain balanced with awareness. Controlled dominance does not ignore the perspectives of others. Instead, it listens carefully before acting. The difference is that listening is used to gather insight, not to avoid responsibility. Another subtle aspect of controlled dominance is the ability to remain unmoved by provocation. When someone attempts to challenge your authority, they often hope to provoke an emotional response. If you react angrily or defensively, the situation escalates and your composure weakens. But when you remain calm, acknowledging the challenge without losing control, the psychological advantage shifts. Others observe the contrast: one person reacting emotionally, the other remaining composed. And in that contrast, authority becomes visible. This is why some of the most powerful individuals appear almost quiet in tense situations. They are not rushing to prove their dominance. They are allowing their stability to speak for itself. Controlled dominance also requires self-respect. If you do not respect your own time, your own boundaries, and your own direction, others will sense it immediately. Self-respect influences posture, tone, decision-making, and presence. It shapes the way you walk into a room and the way you handle disagreement. People rarely follow someone who does not believe in their own worth. But when someone clearly values themselves, others begin valuing them as well. This does not mean arrogance. Arrogance often pushes people away because it feels forced and insecure. True self-respect is quiet. It does not need validation. It does not demand attention. It simply exists. And when self-respect combines with calm authority, controlled dominance emerges naturally. Another reason this tactic is powerful is because it creates predictable stability. While controlled unpredictability keeps others from manipulating you, controlled dominance reassures people that you are capable of maintaining order. These two forces balance each other. One creates caution, the other creates trust. Together, they produce influence. Because influence requires both mystery and reliability. People must respect your boundaries and unpredictability, but they must also trust your judgment. When these elements combine, your presence begins affecting social dynamics automatically. People listen more carefully. They hesitate before challenging you. They consider your perspective even before you speak. Not because you demanded authority, but because your behavior consistently demonstrates it. Controlled dominance is the final piece of the psychological framework we have been building throughout this monologue. Silence gathers information. Framing shapes perception. Unpredictability disrupts manipulation. Detachment protects emotional independence. And controlled dominance establishes quiet authority. These 5 strategies together form a mindset that shifts how you move through the world. You stop chasing validation. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop allowing others to control the emotional direction of conversations. Instead, you begin observing, choosing, and directing interactions with intention. And once you begin operating from this mindset, something subtle changes. People begin responding to you differently, not because you demanded respect, but because your presence naturally commands it. If you understand the power of this final principle, write this phrase in the comments right now: "Calm is my power." Let that phrase remind you that dominance is not about force. It is about composure, clarity, and self-control. But before we end this journey, there is one final reflection we must make. Because learning these psychological tactics is not about manipulating others for ego or vanity. It is about understanding the hidden rules that govern human behavior. And in the final section, we will bring everything together. The true lesson behind these 5 dark psychology strategies, and why mastering them is ultimately about mastering yourself. Now that you've seen the 5 dark psychology tactics: silence, framing, controlled unpredictability, strategic detachment, and controlled dominance, you may start noticing something unsettling. These strategies are not rare. They are used every day. In boardrooms, in politics, in negotiations, in relationships. Once your awareness sharpens, you begin to see the invisible patterns that guide human interactions. Conversations that once seemed random suddenly reveal structure. Reactions that once confused you begin to make sense. You start recognizing who is reacting emotionally and who is quietly steering the situation. Most people never reach this level of awareness. They move through life reacting to circumstances instead of understanding them. Someone challenges them, and they react emotionally. Someone pressures them, and they give in quickly just to avoid discomfort. Someone frames a conversation in a certain way, and they accept the frame without realizing it. Without awareness, people unknowingly play roles in psychological games they never even knew existed. But awareness changes everything. The moment you begin observing human behavior instead of reacting blindly, you gain distance from the chaos that controls most people. You start seeing the emotional triggers that guide others. You notice when someone tries to rush you into a decision. You notice when someone attempts to provoke you emotionally. And because you notice these patterns, you are no longer controlled by them. This is where true psychological power begins. Machiavelli believed that understanding human nature was one of the greatest advantages a person could possess, not because it allowed them to manipulate everyone around them, but because it prevented them from being manipulated themselves. Knowledge of power protects you from deception. It allows you to recognize intentions hidden behind polite words. It allows you to see through emotional tactics designed to pressure you. And once you see these things clearly, you stop feeling intimidated by them. Instead of reacting impulsively, you observe. Instead of rushing to prove yourself, you stay composed. Instead of chasing approval, you maintain your direction. This mindset creates something powerful: psychological independence. Psychological independence means your decisions are not driven by fear of rejection or hunger for validation. You no longer adjust your behavior simply to please others or avoid criticism. Instead, you evaluate situations calmly and choose responses that align with your long-term goals. Most people never reach this point because they are constantly seeking approval. Approval from friends, colleagues, family, society. They measure their worth through the reactions of others. And because their emotional state depends on those reactions, they become extremely easy to influence. But the individual who no longer depends on constant approval becomes very difficult to control. This is why confident individuals often appear mysterious. They are not desperate for agreement. They are not shaken by disagreement. They simply move according to their own internal compass. That independence quietly shifts social dynamics. People begin respecting individuals who do not constantly seek validation. Because someone who does not chase approval appears to have something valuable. Self-trust. Self-trust is rare. Most people doubt themselves constantly. They second-guess their decisions. They worry about how others will interpret their actions. That doubt leaks into their behavior, making them hesitant and reactive. But when someone trusts their own judgment, they project stability, and stability attracts influence. This does not mean ignoring others completely. Wisdom still requires listening, observing, and learning. But psychological independence means you are not controlled by every opinion that enters the room. You evaluate ideas instead of absorbing them automatically. You consider criticism without allowing it to define your identity. You remain open-minded without losing your own direction. This balance between openness and independence is where real confidence lives. Another truth you will begin noticing is that many people fear silence, uncertainty, and emotional control because these qualities disrupt their expectations. They are used to conversations driven by noise and emotional reactions. When someone introduces calm observation into that environment, it changes the rhythm of interaction. Suddenly, the conversation slows down. People think more carefully before speaking. They become aware that their words are being analyzed instead of absorbed emotionally. This subtle shift often reveals the true nature of people around you. Some will respect it, some will feel uncomfortable, and some will attempt to challenge it. But those reactions are valuable information. They reveal who thrives on chaos and who respects discipline. Over time, your ability to observe these patterns will sharpen your understanding of people. You will begin recognizing emotional triggers quickly. You will notice who reacts impulsively and who thinks strategically. You will see who attempts to control conversations through pressure and who prefers clarity. This awareness does not turn you into a manipulator. It turns you into a student of human behavior. And understanding behavior gives you choices. You can step away from unnecessary conflicts. You can refuse emotional traps. You can guide conversations toward productive outcomes. Instead of being pulled into chaos, you become someone who can navigate it. And that is where real strength emerges. Strength is not constant confrontation. Strength is clarity. Clarity about your values. Clarity about your boundaries. Clarity about the direction you are moving. When these elements align, your presence begins to influence situations without force. You do not need to dominate every conversation. You do not need to win every argument. You simply remain steady while others lose balance. And steadiness is powerful, because in a world full of noise, emotional reactions, and impulsive decisions, the calm observer becomes rare. Rare individuals attract attention. Rare individuals command respect. Rare individuals shape outcomes. If this perspective resonates with you, write this phrase in the comments right now: I see the game clearly. Let that phrase remind you that awareness is the beginning of mastery. But there is still one final truth we must confront. Because learning these strategies is not the end of the journey. It is only the beginning of something deeper. At this point, you've seen the mechanics of power: silence, framing, unpredictability, detachment, controlled dominance. On the surface, these look like strategies for influencing other people. But if you look deeper, you'll notice something more important. Every single one of these tactics requires one thing first: control over yourself. Without that, none of them work. Silence requires control over your urge to speak. Framing requires control over your emotions when challenged. Unpredictability requires control over your impulses. Detachment requires control over your feelings. And controlled dominance requires control over your ego. In other words, before you can influence the psychology of others, you must master your own.